The cold static crackled first, a hiss that clawed its way through the placid hum of the air traffic control center. Then came the voice, strained and breathless, a fissure in the calm veneer of a routine Tuesday night. It was the voice of Captain Elias Vance, a man with 20,000 hours of flight time, a man who had seen everything the sky had to offer, or so he thought. His words painted a picture of impossibility over the radio waves, a frantic sketch of something that did not belong at 12,000 feet over the jagged spine of the Cascade Mountains. He spoke of a light, not a star, not another aircraft, but a brilliant, searing luminescence that moved with a predatory intelligence. It danced around his small cargo plane, a Cessna 208 Caravan, with a speed and agility that defied the laws of physics as he understood them. The air traffic controller, a young man named David Chen, listened with a growing sense of dread, his knuckles white on the console. Vance was not a man given to hyperbole. He was a rock, a veteran of desert storms and Arctic squalls, a pilot whose voice was typically a low, reassuring baritone. But the voice now crackling in Chen's headset was thin, reedy, laced with a cocktail of awe and raw, primal fear. What was he seeing up there, alone in the velvet blackness of the Pacific Northwest sky? The object, Vance reported, was metallic, dark, and non-aerodynamic. It had no wings, no visible engines, no tail. It was a wound in the night, a shape that felt fundamentally wrong, a geometric anomaly hanging silently in the air before it would explode into motion. It moved in impossible vectors, making instantaneous right-angle turns that would have turned any human pilot into a red stain against their seat. For 7 minutes, the radio became a lifeline to an event beyond comprehension. Vance's breath grew shorter, his sentences more fragmented. He was climbing, pushing the Cessna beyond its operational limits, trying to get above the object, trying to identify it, to make sense of a phenomenon that was actively dismantling his reality. The controller pleaded with him to break off, to maintain his course, but Vance was transfixed, a moth drawn not to a flame, but to a cold, alien fire. His last transmission was not a sentence, but a series of disjointed observations that have since become the gospel of ufologists and the unending nightmare of his family. He spoke of the object hovering directly in front of him, of a section of its dark hull seeming to dilate, to open like an aperture. He mentioned a green light, a soft enveloping glow that filled his cockpit. Then, a single, sharp intake of breath, a sound of utter astonishment, followed by a phrase that chilled everyone who heard the tapes. "It's not from here," he whispered, his voice a ghost on the frequency. Then, nothing. Just the cold, indifferent hiss of static. On the radar screen in the control center, 2 blips had been tracking in unnervingly close proximity. One was Vance's plane, identifier N417EV. The other was a phantom, an unknown that had appeared from nowhere and had not responded to any hails. At 23:47 Pacific Standard Time, both blips vanished simultaneously. Not one after the other, not a descent, not a breakup. They were simply there 1 second and gone the next, wiped clean from the screen as if they had never existed. In the sterile, quiet room, David Chen stared at the empty space on his monitor, the ghost image of the 2 targets burned into his retinas. He called out for N417EV again and again, his professional calm cracking, his voice echoing in the sudden profound silence. The only answer was the empty static, a sound that now seemed to be mocking him, a sound that was the auditory equivalent of a void. A pilot, a plane, and an unidentified flying object had just disappeared from the face of the earth, 12,000 feet above a wilderness that was already legendary for swallowing secrets. The Cascade vanishing, as it would come to be known, had just begun. The questions started immediately, whispered in hushed tones in the corridors of the FAA and NORAD. Where did the plane go? What was the second radar target? And what, in God's name, had Captain Elias Vance encountered in the final, terrifying moments of his life? The official search would begin at dawn, but for those who heard the final transmission, there was a chilling certainty that they would not find a crash site. You cannot find wreckage for a craft that did not fall, but was instead taken. The sky had opened and swallowed one of its own, leaving behind only a recording of a good man's last unbelievable words and a silence that felt heavier, more profound than any sound. The mystery was not just about a missing plane. It was about the very nature of the sky we thought we knew, and the unnerving possibility of what else might be navigating the darkness between the stars, just beyond our sight. To understand the magnitude of what was lost on that clear, cold night, one must first understand the man at the center of the storm. Captain Elias Vance was not a thrill-seeker, nor was he a fantasist. He was, by every measure, the embodiment of professional aviation. At 58 years old, his face was a roadmap of his life, etched with the fine lines of 1,000 sunrises viewed from a cockpit, and the steady, discerning gaze of a man who had spent more of his life in the third dimension than in the 2 dimensions of the ground-bound world. He was a former Air Force pilot, having flown C-130 Hercules transport planes during the First Gulf War, navigating treacherous airspaces under the most demanding conditions imaginable. His military record was impeccable, decorated for his calm under pressure, and his preternatural ability to coax his aircraft through situations that would have broken lesser men. After 2 decades of service, he transitioned to civilian life, but he could not leave the sky. It was in his blood, the pull of the horizon, an inseparable part of his soul. He settled in the Pacific Northwest, flying cargo for a small but reliable company that serviced the remote communities scattered throughout the Cascade and Olympic mountain ranges. It was not glamorous work. He transported mail, medical supplies, and machine parts in his trusty Cessna Caravan, a workhorse of an aircraft he knew as well as the back of his own hand. He was a pilot's pilot, meticulous in his pre-flight checks, obsessive about weather patterns, and deeply respectful of the power of both his machine and the environment in which he operated. His colleagues described him as quiet, reserved, but with a dry wit that would emerge during late-night coffee breaks. He was a man of routine and precision. His flight logs were works of art, every entry neat, every calculation double-checked. He didn't drink, he didn't smoke, and his last physical had declared him to be in better health than men half his age. This was the man who reported a silent, wingless craft moving in impossible ways. Had such a report come from a young, inexperienced pilot, it might have been dismissed as a misidentification of a weather balloon, a meteor, or the planet Venus. It might have been chalked up to hypoxia or simple panic. But this was Elias Vance. When he said he saw something that defied explanation, the world of aviation was forced to listen, even if it did not want to. His personal life was as stable and unremarkable as his professional one. He was married to his high school sweetheart, Sarah, for 35 years. They had 2 grown children, a son who was a marine biologist, and a daughter who was a teacher. He was a grandfather. He spent his weekends hiking the very mountains he flew over, his love for the rugged wilderness of the region a core part of his identity. He was not a man prone to flights of fancy. His imagination was firmly anchored in the tangible world of lift, drag, thrust, and weight. He had a passing interest in astronomy, owning a small telescope he would occasionally set up in his backyard, but he had no history of interest in UFOs or the paranormal. In fact, his friends and family reported that he was openly skeptical of such things, often attributing strange sightings to mundane explanations with the calm authority of a seasoned aviator. This skepticism is perhaps the most crucial element of the entire mystery. For Elias Vance to report what he reported, he must have first exhausted every other possibility in his highly trained analytical mind. He would have considered atmospheric phenomena, other aircraft, military test vehicles, even the possibility of a trick of the light or a personal hallucination. For him to reach the conclusion that he was witnessing something not from here, he must have been presented with evidence so overwhelming, so undeniable, that it shattered his entire framework of the known world in a matter of minutes. The investigators who would later pore over his life, searching for any crack, any instability that could explain his final report, would find nothing. There was no financial trouble, no marital strife, no secret illness, no psychological distress. There was only the portrait of a man in complete command of his faculties, his aircraft, and his life. This portrait of stability makes the event infinitely more disturbing. It removes the comfortable cushion of human error and leaves us with the stark, chilling reality of his words. The man was credible. The witness was unimpeachable. Therefore, the event he described in all its terrifying impossibility must be considered not as a fiction, but as a testimony. He was the perfect witness to the unbelievable, a man whose entire life was a testament to his reliability, chosen by fate or by something else to be the messenger of a truth so profound it cost him his existence. The disappearance of Elias Vance was not just the loss of a plane. It was the silencing of a credible voice, a voice that told us we are not alone in the most direct and terrifying way imaginable. The authorities would later try to paint a picture of a man who became disoriented, who panicked, who made a fatal error. But those who knew him, and those who have studied the case, know that this is the greatest fiction of all. The man did not fail. His understanding of the world failed him, confronted by something that simply should not be. The stage for this impossible drama was a landscape as enigmatic and ancient as the mystery itself. The Cascade Mountain Range, a formidable wall of volcanic peaks stretching from British Columbia down to Northern California, is a place of breathtaking beauty and profound danger. It is a land of extremes, of serene alpine meadows and violent, unpredictable weather, of silent, dense forests, and the ever-present threat of seismic fury rumbling deep within the earth. For centuries, this has been a place that inspires both awe and a deep, instinctual fear. The native tribes of the region have stories that go back millennia, legends of mountain spirits, of strange beings that inhabit the highest, most inaccessible peaks, and of mysterious lights that dance in the night sky. These were not just campfire stories. They were warnings, oral traditions that spoke of a world far more complex and mysterious than the one visible in the light of day. They spoke of Sasquatch, the wild man of the woods, but also of other, less definable things, of forces that dwelt in the liminal spaces between the known and the unknown. This ancient tradition of high strangeness seemed to bleed into the modern era. Long before the disappearance of Captain Elias Vance, the region had earned a chilling nickname among pilots and researchers of anomalous phenomena, the Oregon Triangle. Similar to its more famous counterpart in the Bermuda Seas, this vast, loosely defined area, encompassing much of the rugged wilderness of southern and central Oregon, had become a graveyard for aircraft. Since the 1940s, dozens of planes and hundreds of people have vanished within its boundaries, often without a trace. The official explanations, severe downdrafts, sudden storms, pilot error, never seem to fully account for the sheer number of incidents or the complete lack of wreckage in many cases. It was as if the mountains themselves had an appetite, a capacity to swallow planes whole, leaving no debris, no oil slicks, no final radio calls. One of the most famous historical cases was the 1947 disappearance of a U.S. Air Force C-46 transport plane, which vanished with 32 servicemen on board. Despite one of the largest search efforts in military history, no trace of the aircraft was ever found. It simply ceased to exist. In 1965, a private plane carrying a family of 4 disappeared on a clear day near Mount Rainier. Again, the search was massive and exhaustive, but not a single piece of the plane or its occupants was ever recovered. The list goes on, a litany of vanishings that defy easy explanation. These events created a kind of background radiation of mystery, a persistent hum of the unexplained that permeated the local culture. Pilots who flew the Cascade routes spoke in hushed tones of strange magnetic fluctuations that would send their compasses spinning, of ghost radar returns that would appear and disappear, and of unsettling feelings of being watched as they navigated the lonely mountain passes. These were not things one reported in an official log, but they were shared between trusted colleagues, a part of the informal knowledge required to survive in this beautiful but unforgiving airspace. Beyond the disappearances, the region was a hotbed for UFO sightings. The famous 1947 sighting by pilot Kenneth Arnold, which gave birth to the term flying saucer, occurred near Mount Rainier, at the very heart of the Cascade Range. Arnold described a string of 9 crescent-shaped objects flying at incredible speed, weaving between the peaks. His sighting, made by a respected pilot and businessman, kicked off the modern UFO era. In the decades that followed, thousands of reports would emerge from the Pacific Northwest, silent triangular craft hovering over remote forests, brilliant orbs of light pacing cars on lonely highways, strange metallic objects seen diving into the deep cold waters of lakes like Crater Lake, itself a collapsed volcano and a place of immense geological power and mystery. So when Elias Vance took to the sky on that fateful night, he was not flying into a void. He was flying into a place with a deep, layered history of the strange. He was traversing an area where the membrane between our reality and another seemed unusually thin, a place where the impossible had been reported time and time again. This context is crucial. His encounter did not happen in a vacuum. It was the culmination, the most dramatic and terrifying data point in a long and disturbing trend. Was there something about the geology of the region, its volcanic nature and magnetic anomalies, that attracted these phenomena? Or was it simply that its vast, sparsely populated wilderness provided the perfect cover for something that did not wish to be widely seen? The authorities would later ignore this history, treating Vance's disappearance as an isolated mechanical event. But to do so is to ignore the pattern, to dismiss the chorus of voices and events that all point to the same unsettling conclusion. Something is active in the skies over the Cascade Mountains, something ancient, intelligent, and utterly alien. Elias Vance, the rationalist, the skeptic, may not have believed in the legends of the Oregon Triangle. But on his final flight, he did not just encounter a strange light. He flew headlong into the heart of the region's deepest and darkest secret, and in doing so, became its most permanent and haunting legend. The day of the disappearance began with an almost aggressive normalcy. Tuesday, November 14th, dawned cold and clear over the Puget Sound. A crisp autumn air settled over the region, promising excellent visibility and calm winds, the kind of day pilots dream of. For Captain Elias Vance, it was the start of a routine cargo run, a familiar route he had flown hundreds of times before. The flight plan was simple: a late evening departure from a small airfield south of Seattle, a 2-hour flight south to Klamath Falls, Oregon, where he would drop off a shipment of urgent medical supplies, and then a return flight home. It was a milk run, a simple out and back that he could have flown in his sleep. He spent the day at home with his wife, Sarah. They worked in the garden, raking the last of the fallen leaves, and had an early dinner. There was nothing to suggest this day would be any different from the thousands that had preceded it. He was calm, content, his mind already partially in the sky, running through the familiar mental checklists of his profession. He arrived at the airfield just after sunset, the sky a brilliant tapestry of orange and purple. He greeted the ground crew with a familiar nod and began his pre-flight inspection of the Cessna 208 Caravan, tail number N417EV. He was, as always, meticulous. He walked the perimeter of the aircraft, his flashlight beam dancing over the fuselage, the wings, the propeller. He checked the fuel for contaminants, inspected the tires, and ran his hand along the leading edges of the wings, feeling for any imperfections. Everything was perfect. The aircraft, a reliable workhorse, had just come out of a major service 2 weeks prior and had a clean bill of health. The logs showed no outstanding issues, no recurring glitches. It was a sound machine, ready for a sound pilot. He climbed into the cockpit, the familiar scent of aviation fuel and worn leather greeting him like an old friend. He powered on the avionics, the cockpit slowly coming to life with the soft glow of instrument panels and screens. The weather reports confirmed what the sky was already showing: clear conditions all the way down the corridor, with light tailwinds that would even shorten his flight time slightly. It was, for all intents and purposes, a perfect night to fly. At 22:15 Pacific Standard Time, Vance taxied N417EV onto the runway. He made his final checks, his voice a calm monotone as he communicated with the tower. Tower, Caravan N417EV, ready for departure, runway 34. The clearance came back, and with a steady push of the throttle, the Cessna surged forward, its single turboprop engine biting into the cold night air. It lifted off gracefully, a small, solitary light climbing into the immense star-dusted darkness. For the first hour and 15 minutes, the flight was utterly uneventful. Vance guided the plane to its cruising altitude of 12,000 feet, the lights of civilization below shrinking into a glittering carpet. He was in constant contact with air traffic control, his check-ins brief and professional. Seattle Center, Caravan 417 EV, level at 12,000. The responses were equally routine. He was just another light among many, a known quantity moving along a predictable path. He passed over the sprawling metropolis of Portland, its orange glow a familiar landmark. As he continued south, the urban sprawl gave way to the deep, uninterrupted blackness of the Mount Hood National Forest and the wider Cascade Range. This was the loneliest part of the journey, a vast expanse of dark, rugged terrain where the only signs of life were the occasional faint lights of a remote farmhouse. It is in these moments of profound solitude that the sky can feel both like a sanctuary and an unnervingly vast and empty cathedral. What were his thoughts in those final minutes of normalcy? Was he thinking of the delivery, of the flight back, of the cup of tea his wife would have waiting for him? Or did he feel it before he saw it? A subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change in the pressure, the primal animal instinct that you are no longer alone. We will never know. The official record only begins at 23:39, when the calm routine was shattered forever. It was then that Vance's voice came over the radio, no longer the placid professional, but with a new edge, a note of confused urgency. Seattle Center, Caravan 417 EV. I have a visual on some unusual traffic, off my left wing, about my 10 o'clock position. The controller, David Chen, checked his screen. There was nothing. The sky around Vance's plane was, according to the radar, completely empty. The ordinary had ended. The veil had been torn. What began as a simple cargo run was about to escalate into one of the most baffling and terrifying encounters in the history of modern aviation. The perfect night had become the perfect stage for an impossible event, its clarity and calmness serving only to highlight the absolute strangeness of what was to come. The initial report from Captain Vance was tinged with professional curiosity, not alarm. He was a pilot seeing something he could not immediately categorize, and his training compelled him to investigate, to understand, to place the unknown into a known box. Seattle Center, this traffic it's illuminated, a very bright white light. But I'm not getting a strobe, and I don't see any navigation lights, he radioed, his voice steady. On the ground, David Chen keyed his microphone, his eyes glued to the empty airspace on his radar screen. Caravan 417 EV, be advised I have no radar returns in your vicinity. Can you confirm the traffic is an aircraft? This was the first official flag, the first moment the incident transitioned from a simple sighting to a genuine anomaly. An object bright enough to be seen clearly by a pilot, but completely invisible to ground-based radar. Vance's response was hesitant. Negative, Center. I cannot confirm it's an aircraft. There's no distinct shape to it right now, just the light. It's holding a steady position relative to me. For a few moments, a tense silence hung in the air, punctuated only by the faint hum of electronics in the control center. The mundane explanations were the first to be considered. Could it be a high-altitude weather balloon? Unlikely at night, and they wouldn't be so brilliantly illuminated. A meteor? A meteor would burn across the sky in seconds, not hold a stationary position. The planet Venus? Vance was a veteran pilot and an amateur astronomer. He would not make such a fundamental mistake. Then, the object moved. Center, the traffic is now accelerating. Vance's voice was suddenly sharper, the curiosity being rapidly replaced by disbelief. It's moving towards me, very fast. Chen's heart rate quickened. Caravan 417 EV, do you need to take evasive action? Before Vance could answer, he let out a low whistle, a sound of pure astonishment that was clearly audible over the radio. My God, it just stopped. It went from a very high rate of speed to a dead stop, maybe a mile off my port wing, instantaneously. The description was a direct violation of the laws of inertia. No physical object, no conventional aircraft could perform such a maneuver. The G-forces would be astronomical, enough to tear any known machine apart and instantly kill any occupants. This was the moment the event tipped from strange to impossible. The object was no longer just a light. As it drew closer, or as Vance's eyes adjusted, he began to make out a solid form behind the brilliance. "Center, I'm getting a shape now," he said, his voice dropping lower. It's dark. A very dark metallic surface. No seams, no windows, no visible propulsion. It's shaped like a flattened pyramid, maybe? Or a triangle. The geometry is sharp, precise. He was struggling for words, for analogies, to describe something that had no terrestrial counterpart. He described how the intense light seemed to emanate not from a specific source, like a bulb or a lens, but from the very air around the object, a glowing ionization that pulsed with a soft, rhythmic beat. The object then began to exhibit what could only be described as playful, or perhaps exploratory behavior. It started to circle his Cessna, not in a smooth, aerodynamic arc, but in a series of jarring, instantaneous 90-degree turns. It would be at his 10 o'clock, and in the blink of an eye, it would be at his 3 o'clock, having traversed the distance in a way that made no logical sense. It was a display of technological superiority so profound, it was almost insulting. Vance, in his sturdy but comparatively primitive propeller plane, was like a canoe being circled by a nuclear submarine. The psychological pressure on him must have been immense. His entire world, built on the predictable physics of flight, was being unwritten before his very eyes. Every instinct, every hour of training was telling him that what he was seeing was not possible. Yet, it was there, solid, real, and utterly alien. "Center, this thing is toying with me," he said, the strain now clearly evident. "It's anticipating my movements. I bank left, it's already there. I start to climb, and it's above me in an instant." At this point, a second controller at Seattle Center, alerted by Chen, confirmed that a faint, intermittent target was now appearing on a secondary, more sensitive radar system. It was a ghost, a phantom that would solidify for a few sweeps of the radar dish and then vanish again. It corresponded exactly to the position Vance was describing. The anomaly was now confirmed electronically. It was real. The tension in the control center was palpable. The supervisors were on the line, NORAD had been patched in, and a dozen pairs of eyes were now focused on the single blinking light of N417EV and the spectral ghost that haunted it. They were all silent witnesses, powerless spectators to a drama unfolding miles above the earth. Vance's voice came again, this time with a note of decision. "Center, I'm going to try and get a closer look. I'm deviating from my flight plan to pursue." It was a fateful choice, one that would be debated for years to come. Was he acting out of protocol, or was he compelled by a force beyond simple curiosity? Was it his decision, or was he being drawn in, lured into a celestial dance from which he would not return? The controller's order was clear. "Caravan 417EV, negative. Maintain your present course and altitude. Do not engage." But it was too late. The response from the sky was chilling. "I can't," Vance said, his voice a strained whisper. "It's right in front of me now. It's not letting me go." The nature of the encounter shifted in an instant. It was no longer a sighting. It had become a confrontation. The transition from passive observation to active pursuit was not a decision, made solely by Elias Vance. The object, with its silent, omniscient presence, seemed to be dictating the terms of engagement. When Vance reported that he was unable to break away, that the object was blocking his path, the event entered its most terrifying phase. He was no longer a pilot in control of his aircraft. He was a captive, ensnared in a gravitational or psychological net from which there was no escape. The transcript of the next few minutes is a chilling descent into the unknown. Vance began pushing his Cessna, climbing at a rate that put a dangerous strain on its single engine. The sound of the straining turboprop became a constant, high-pitched whine in the background of his transmissions. He was trying to climb above the object, a classic maneuver to gain a positional advantage. But it was a futile effort. The triangular craft matched his ascent effortlessly, maintaining its position directly in front of him, a dark and silent gatekeeper in the sky. "It's staying with me, no matter what I do," Vance gasped, his breathing now ragged from the adrenaline and the increasing altitude. Altitude now 14,000, passing 15,000. And it's still right there, like it's glued to my nose. At 15,000 feet, the air is thin. The unpressurized cabin of the Cessna Caravan would have been growing cold, the oxygen levels dropping. While not immediately life-threatening, the effects of mild hypoxia, confusion, euphoria, impaired judgment could begin to set in. The official report would later lean heavily on this possibility, suggesting that Vance became disoriented and lost control. But the clarity and specificity of his next descriptions defied this simple explanation. He was not confused. He was a man reporting with terrifying lucidity on an event that was pushing him to the very edge of human endurance. The chase, if it could be called that, was entirely one-sided. The object was a predator, and the Cessna was its prey. It would occasionally dart away at impossible speeds, vanishing from sight, only to reappear moments later from a completely different direction. It was a display of absolute technological dominance, a psychological game that seemed designed to disorient and terrify. Imagine the experience from Vance's perspective. Alone in the vast, cold emptiness of the night sky, strapped into a small, vibrating machine, while a silent, incomprehensible object performs miracles of physics all around you. It would be an experience that would shatter the psyche of the strongest individual. Vance's voice, a mirror to his mental state, began to lose its structure. His sentences became shorter, more primal. "It's gone. No, there. Off the right side now. So fast. The light, it's changing color. Pulsing. Red to green." NORAD, now fully engaged, was scrambling to get a satellite lock on the area, but the process was slow. They diverted a pair of F-15 fighter jets from a base in Portland, but they were 20 minutes away, a lifetime in this unfolding situation. On the ground, the controllers could do nothing but listen, their own sense of helplessness growing with every strained transmission. They were tethered to a man who was being pulled further and further from their world. The climax of the chase began when the object ceased its erratic movements and once again took up a stationary position directly in front of and slightly above Vance's climbing aircraft. It was waiting for him. Okay, it stopped again," Vance said, his voice a strange mix of fear and resignation. "I'm approaching it, closing in, maybe 500 feet away now. It's huge, much bigger than I thought. It's blocking out the stars." He was now describing the object in greater detail, the proximity affording him a view that no one had ever reported before and survived. "The surface, it's not smooth. It looks like it's flowing, like liquid metal, rippling. There's no heat. My instruments are, my compass is spinning. All my navigation is shot. The GPS is gone." This detail was critical. The object was emitting some kind of powerful electromagnetic field, an energy source that was overriding the Cessna's electronic systems. This was not a passive object. It was active, projecting a field of influence around it. It was this detail that convinced many investigators that the official explanation of mechanical failure was not just wrong, but a deliberate fabrication. The failure was not random. It was being induced by an external force. The chase was over. Vance had been reeled in. He was now face to face with the phenomenon, close enough to see its impossible nature, close enough to be caught in its field. The hunter had become the specimen, and the final terrible act of the drama was about to unfold. The F-15s were still minutes away, screaming through the night sky, but they were racing towards a ghost, an echo of an event whose critical moments were already happening. The pilot was alone, cut off from his technology, facing a power that was beyond his comprehension, and his next words would mark the point of no return. The final 60 seconds of the radio transmission from Captain Elias Vance are perhaps the most famous and terrifying in the annals of unexplained aerial phenomena. They represent a boundary crossing, a message sent back from a threshold between our world and another. After reporting the failure of his navigation instruments in the liquid-like surface of the massive triangular craft hanging before him, Vance's voice dropped to an awed whisper. The terror that had laced his words during the chase was replaced by something else, something harder to define, a sense of profound, paralyzing wonder. "Center, do you see this?" he asked, a rhetorical question born of sheer disbelief. "The bottom of the craft, a section of it is changing. It's not opening like a door. It's becoming transparent. I can see inside." The controllers on the ground were silent, leaning into their speakers, straining to catch every syllable. What could he possibly be seeing? What lay inside a vessel that could defy the laws of physics? Vance's description was fragmented, the words of a man trying to process sensory input for which he had no existing vocabulary. There's no crew, no control, just light, a soft green light. It's swirling, like a nebula. It's beautiful. The word beautiful hangs in the transcript, a stark and haunting contrast to the terror of the situation. Was he experiencing a neurological effect from the object's energy field, a form of induced euphoria? Or was he genuinely witnessing something of such alien grandeur that it transcended fear? This question lies at the heart of the mystery. Then, the tone shifted again, a final sharp pivot back to alarm. The swirling green light inside the object was not static. It was beginning to coalesce, to move, to project outwards. "Oh God," Vance breathed, the wonder evaporating, replaced by a sudden dawning horror. The light, it's coming out. It's forming a cone, a tunnel of light stretching out from the craft. It's coming right for me. On the ground, David Chen grabbed his microphone, his voice tight with panic. "Caravan 417 EV, break away. Evasive action now. Dive, do you read me? Elias, dive." But there was no response, only the sound of Vance's sharp, ragged breathing. The electronic whine of the Cessna's engine, which had been a constant presence, began to sputter, as if the energy field from the object was now actively interfering with the aircraft's mechanical and electrical systems. The final words of Captain Elias Vance were spoken with a strange, chilling calmness, the voice of a man who has seen his fate and accepted it. "It's all around me. The green light, it's in the cockpit. It's so bright. There's no sound. It's not hot. It feels cold." There was a pause, a fraction of a second that seemed to stretch for an eternity. Then, a single sharp intake of breath, a gasp of ultimate realization, and his last whispered message to the world: "It's not an aircraft." A click, a burst of high-frequency static, a sound that researchers would later analyze and describe as a complex, non-random energy discharge. And then, absolute, profound silence. At precisely that moment, 23:47 Pacific Standard Time, the radar blip for N411 EV vanished from the screen at Seattle Center. The secondary phantom target disappeared in the exact same instant. There was no trail of debris, no indication of a descent, no sign of an explosion. One moment they were there, two distinct points of light and energy at 16,000 feet. The next, they were gone. The space they had occupied was empty. The controllers called his name over and over. "Caravan N417 EV, do you read? Captain Vance? Respond!" The calls went out into the void, unanswered. The silence that followed was heavier than any explosion. It was the sound of an event that had no precedent, a disappearance so total and so strange it defied all conventional explanation. The F-15s arrived on the scene 7 minutes later. They found nothing. The sky was empty, clear, and cold. Their instruments detected no wreckage, no heat signatures on the ground, no residual radiation. They reported a lingering, faint trace of ozone in the air, a detail often associated with high-energy electrical discharges, but it was too faint to be conclusive. The plane, the pilot, and the impossible object that had haunted him had vanished as if they had been erased from reality itself. The climax was not a crash, but an abduction. Not an explosion, but a quiet and complete removal. Captain Vance did not fall from the sky. The sky itself reached down and took him. The final transmission is his epitaph, a testament not to pilot error, but to a brave man reporting on an impossible truth until the very second that truth consumed him. The immediate aftermath of the Cascade vanishing was a study in controlled chaos. In the minutes following the disappearance of N417EV, the Air Traffic Control Center became the nucleus of a rapidly expanding storm of official inquiry. The audio logs were secured, the radar data was frozen, and a series of encrypted communications began flashing between the FAA, NORAD, and the Pentagon. Before the sun had even risen, a narrative was already being shaped, a story designed to contain a truth that was deemed too disruptive for public consumption. The first public-facing action was the launch of a massive search and rescue operation. At dawn, the Civil Air Patrol, along with Coast Guard and Air Force helicopters, began to scour the vast, rugged wilderness of the Cascade Mountains below Vance's last known position. For days, the skies were filled with the drone of search aircraft, and the ground was covered by teams of mountaineers and Forestry Service personnel. The media reported on the desperate search for the missing pilot, and the public watched, hoping for a miracle. But the teams on the ground and in the air found nothing. Not a single scrap of metal, not a shred of fabric, not an oil slick on any of the remote mountain lakes. It was statistically impossible. A Cessna 208 Caravan is not a small aircraft. A crash at high speed, even in rugged terrain, would have left a significant debris field, a scar on the landscape visible for miles. The plane had over 100 gallons of jet fuel, which would have likely caused a massive fire. Yet, the forest below remained pristine, untouched. After 10 days of fruitless searching, covering over 4,000 square miles of some of the most difficult terrain in North America, the official search was quietly scaled back, and then called off. The official statement was somber, expressing regret that the aircraft could not be located and was presumed to have crashed in an inaccessible area. Then came the official explanation, the story crafted by the faceless entity of the Authority. In a joint press conference held by the FAA and the Air Force, a narrative of tragic but mundane accident was presented to the world. They claimed that Captain Vance, flying at an altitude that required supplemental oxygen, which he may not have been using properly, likely experienced hypoxia. This, they suggested, led to disorientation and hallucinations. He misidentified a celestial body, likely the planet Jupiter, which was bright in the sky that night, and in his confused state put his aircraft into a steep dive or stall from which he could not recover. The second radar return, the ghost on the secondary system, was dismissed as a common technical glitch, a phenomenon known as anomalous propagation, or a radar ghost caused by atmospheric conditions. The final, terrifying transmission? The ravings of a mind starved of oxygen, a tragic final testament to his disorientation. The case was closed. Pilot error, a terrible accident, a story neat, tidy, and utterly devoid of any mention of a massive, silent triangular craft that moved in impossible ways. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic obfuscation, a story designed to calm the public and file the uncomfortable reality of the event away in a locked cabinet. The wreckage, they implied, was simply buried too deep in the wilderness to be found, and would likely remain one of the mountain's many secrets. For the general public, this explanation was largely accepted. It was plausible. It was presented by men in uniforms and suits, and it was a far more comfortable reality to accept than the alternative. But for those closer to the event, for Vance's family, for his colleagues, for the air traffic controllers who heard his voice, and for a small, dedicated group of independent researchers, the official story was not just a lie. It was an insult. It was a desecration of the memory of a meticulous and highly competent pilot, a man who did not make those kinds of mistakes. Sarah Vance, Elias's widow, refused to accept the verdict. She knew her husband. She knew his precision, his respect for safety protocols. The idea that he would have been careless about oxygen use, or that he would mistake Jupiter for a craft toying with him, was absurd. The authorities, she claimed, were hiding something. They were protecting a secret far more important than the reputation of one lost pilot. And so, as the official investigation closed its books, another, more persistent one, began in the shadows. The official story, so clean and final, was a dam built to hold back a flood of inconvenient truths. But dams crack. And the cracks in the cascade vanishing narrative began to appear almost immediately, thanks to the tireless efforts of a man who would become the case's chief chronicler and its most ardent investigator. Julian Croft was a retired air crash investigator for the NTSB, a man who had spent 30 years sifting through the wreckage of fallen aircraft, piecing together the final moments of a flight from twisted metal and scorched earth. He was methodical, cynical, and possessed a deep-seated allergy to bureaucratic falsehoods. He had followed the Vance case from the beginning, and the official explanation had set off every alarm bell in his experienced mind. It was too neat, too simple. It ignored too much. Croft came out of retirement and began his own private investigation, operating on his own dime, driven by a professional's need to find the real story. He started with the people. He spoke at length with Sarah Vance, who provided him with her husband's private logs and notes. He interviewed Vance's colleagues, who all painted the same picture of a pilot who was the polar opposite of the reckless, disoriented man described in the official report. They told him stories of Vance's almost supernatural calm in emergencies, his obsession with procedure. One pilot told Croft, "If Elias Vance said he saw a dragon flying off his left wing, I'd have asked him what color it was. He didn't imagine things." Next, Croft turned his attention to the technical details. He knew that the Jupiter explanation was nonsense. Using astronomical software, he confirmed that while Jupiter was visible that night, it was in a completely different sector of the sky from where Vance had reported the object. Furthermore, a planet does not accelerate, stop on a dime, and circle a Cessna. The hypoxia theory was equally flimsy. Vance was at an altitude where supplemental oxygen is recommended but not always strictly required for short periods, especially for a man in his excellent physical condition. More importantly, the symptoms of hypoxia tend to be gradual and lead to sluggishness and confusion, not the kind of detailed, lucid, and increasingly terrified reporting that Vance had provided. The real breakthrough, however, came from a source deep within the FAA. A disgruntled air traffic controller who felt the official story was a betrayal of a fellow aviator anonymously leaked a crucial piece of evidence to Croft, a copy of the raw radar data from the more sensitive secondary system. The official report had claimed the blip was an intermittent ghost, but the raw data told a different story. The unknown object, designated UTC-1, uncorrelated target 1, was not a random glitch. It tracked in a manner that was intelligent and deliberate. The data showed it performing maneuvers that were physically impossible for any known aircraft. It registered speeds in excess of 4,000 miles per hour, followed by instantaneous stops. It made turns that would have generated hundreds of Gs of force. The radar data was a direct electronic corroboration of every impossible thing Vance had described. It was the smoking gun. Croft then uncovered another suppressed layer of the story: the ground witnesses. The official investigation claimed there were no corroborating reports from the ground. This was a lie. Croft, using local newspaper archives and placing his own ads seeking information, found 3 separate sets of witnesses. A pair of campers near Mount Jefferson reported seeing a bizarre, silent triangular craft with a bright light maneuvering in the sky for several minutes at the exact time of Vance's encounter. They had been afraid to report it, fearing ridicule. A long-haul truck driver on Interstate 5 reported a brilliant green light that seemed to beam down into the clouds in the direction of the mountains, followed by a strange, momentary dimming of his truck's headlights. His report had been dismissed by local police. The most compelling witness was a retired astronomer living in a remote cabin with a powerful telescope. He had been observing that night and had his telescope trained on a distant galaxy when a dark, triangular shape, faintly illuminated by a strange glow, passed through his field of vision. It was moving silently and at a speed he could not calculate, but it was massive, and it was utterly real. When Croft presented his findings, a meticulously compiled dossier of suppressed evidence and contradictory testimony, to a friendly journalist, the official narrative began to crumble. The story of the Cascade vanishing reemerged, this time not as a tragic accident, but as a cover-up. The authority, in its attempt to control the narrative, had only made the mystery deeper, more conspiratorial. They weren't just hiding a case of a missing plane. They were actively suppressing proof of an encounter with a technology so far beyond our own that they had no way to explain it. The question was no longer what happened to Elias Vance, but why the government was so desperate to pretend it hadn't. Croft's investigation revealed that the dam of denial was not built to protect the public from a scary story, but to protect the authorities themselves from the terrifying admission that they were not in control. That for at least 7 minutes on a clear November night, something else was. The legacy of the Cascade vanishing is a tapestry woven from threads of mystery, grief, and conspiracy. It is not a closed case, but a raw, open wound in the official history of modern aviation. On one side, you have the edifice of the official explanation: pilot error, hypoxia, a tragic but understandable accident. It is a story that is clean, rational, and requires no fundamental shift in our understanding of the world. It is a story that allows us to sleep at night, secure in the belief that the sky above is empty, save for the predictable paths of planes and planets. On the other side, you have a mountain of contradictory evidence, a chorus of dissenting voices, and the chilling final testimony of a trusted man. You have the leaked radar data showing an object performing impossible physics. You have the suppressed ground witnesses who saw something silent, massive, and alien in the night. You have the unimpeachable record of a pilot who was the last person on Earth to panic or become disoriented. And you have the complete and total disappearance of a multi-ton aircraft, a vanishing act so perfect it defies all statistical probability of a conventional crash. To accept this second version of events is to accept a paradigm-shifting reality. It is to acknowledge that Captain Elias Vance did not die because he made a mistake. He vanished because he encountered something not of this world, a force or intelligence operating by rules we do not comprehend. His disappearance was not an accident, it was an interaction. The final transmission in this context becomes a field report from the edge of human experience. When Vance described the object opening, the swirling green light, the coldness, was he describing the mechanics of a technology beyond our wildest imaginings? Was the green light a form of transport beam, a tractor beam like something from science fiction? Was the craft a biological probe, a drone sent by an unseen intelligence? Or was the craft itself a living entity? Vance's description of the liquid metal surface, the lack of seams, the organic way it seemed to become transparent, do these point to a form of life so advanced it is indistinguishable from technology? The questions spiral outwards, each one more profound than the last. What was the object's intent? Was the chase a hostile act, or was it a form of communication, a test? Was Vance's pursuit a voluntary act, or was he drawn in, his will subverted by a powerful psychic or technological influence? And the ultimate question, where did he go? Was the aircraft and its pilot disintegrated by the energy discharge heard on the final transmission? Was it transported to another location on Earth or somewhere else entirely, another dimension, another world? The fact that the object on the radar disappeared at the exact same moment as the Cessna suggests a linked event. They did not just vanish, they vanished together. This leads to the most disturbing speculation of all, that this was an abduction, a collection, that Elias Vance and his Cessna Caravan were taken. He was not a victim of a crash, but a specimen, a sample gathered for unknown purposes by an unknown entity. This is the narrative that the authority could not allow. It is one thing to admit the existence of unidentified craft. It is another thing entirely to admit that these craft can, and do, interact with us in ways that are beyond our control, that they can simply remove a person and a plane from the sky without a trace. Such an admission would be a confession of impotence. It would shatter the illusion of national security and governmental control. It would be an acknowledgement that we are not at the top of the food chain. So they lied. They created a comforting fiction to paper over a terrifying truth. The Cascade vanishing, therefore, endures not just as a mystery, but as a symbol of the conflict between witnessed experience and official denial. It is a case study in how institutions react when faced with a phenomenon that threatens their monopoly on power and knowledge. The empty file folder in the NTSB archives, stamped "Case Closed," is a testament to this lie. But the real file, the one kept by researchers like Julian Croft, by the family of Elias Vance, and by those who dare to look at the evidence, remains wide open. It is a file that asks the most fundamental questions a species can ask. Are we alone? What is the true nature of reality? And what happens when an ordinary person on an ordinary night flies headfirst into an extraordinary and terrifying truth? The silence from the sky where Elias Vance once flew is not empty. It is filled with these questions, a permanent and haunting echo of his last unbelievable flight.